Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to Chaplin Days 2021. We're not together again in person this year, but we figured we'd give you some nice online content as far as the museum's getting back to normal and the renovations are going on. So we have a star-studded panel today of folks here. We're going to talk today about Tillie's Punctured Romance, which most Chaplin fans know as the last film that where Charlie was directed by someone else, aka Max Sennett. After this, he went totally on his own and he was the prime director and producer and star, and he didn't take direction from anybody else after this point. So, in and of itself, that makes it an interesting bit of Chaplin history. But as far as film history goes, it is considered the world's first feature length comedy film. So we're going to go around and introduce everybody. So I guess we'll start with Mr. Brent Walker, who is an expert on Keystone Film Company and has written a book or two on the subject. So, yep, they're the fun factory. Yes, indeed. So, Brent, if you want to introduce yourself, and then I guess we'll just go around the table and get everybody introduced.
Well, I've written this book years ago. I co-wrote the films of the Bowery Boys, and I've done a lot of research on various early film comedies besides Max Sennett and other, film areas, as well as contributed to some DVDs. And I used for nearly 20 years. I was a freelance writer for Turner Classic Movies. It's kind of a sideline, but I just got interested in Sennett early on and like the story of it. So that's kind of, this book took a lot of years, but that was the motivating factor.
Very cool. And your book is on Amazon, I would assume, if anybody wants to pick it up.
Yeah. McFarlane, it's in paperback now. It's like nearly 700 pages, so it's a large format. So it's a filmography. There's like 300 biographies of people who worked at the studio, including Chaplin and Mabel and a little bit of Marie Dressler, who made one film. There's others that haven't had bios, unlike those three, so they have a little bit more information because they're more obscure. The directors and things, but the history of Sennett's studio and his really career and life as well.
So this is a question I'll ask everybody real fast. How did you get into this, Brent? What was the first thing you saw of silent comedy or Max Sennett where something clicked in your head and you just said, this is something I want to devote my life to?
No, it was probably when I was a kid on TV, where they would show the Robert Youngsons, like when comedy was king and golden age of comedy. And I would see the wild stuff going on in some of those comedies, and I think it was, there were some of them were Sennett films as well as others, and Chaplin in both his Keystones and other comedies, and later, and also Laurel and Hardy, Three Stooges, etc., Little Rascals on TV. I just kind of always was, what's the story on this? So that used to be that, and you could buy the 8mm movies. This was like the era of, before you could access everything on streaming or DVD. Really, you couldn't. This is even before just, really VHS and Beta just came out, where it was, you could buy a silent comedy on 8mm, and so that's kind of the era where I was just curious, and kind of one thing led to another, doing research on Max Sennett, because there were some various books that his biography and another than Father Goose that told one, kind of myths about him. There were a couple books telling the story of the Keystone, but there wasn't the overall picture. So that's kind of what drove me to do that research. And it
Gotcha.
turned into, wasn't even going to be a book. So until about 10 years in, then it's like, maybe this is a book.
Thank you, Brent. All right, I guess we'll move on to Victoria here. Maybe everybody's in different places here, but I'll kind of go into a big circle.
I'm Victoria Sturtevant. I'm an associate. Oh, sorry. Did I interrupt somebody? I'm an associate professor at the University of Oklahoma. I teach film and media studies. I teach courses in film history and theory and criticism. And I'm author of A Great Big Girl Like Me, the films of Marie Dressler. This came out in 2009, so I still know a lot about Marie Dressler, but I'm afraid some of the names and dates have kind of slipped a little bit in the intervening years. I was trying to remember today all of the details around Tillie's Punctured romance. This group might be the only group in the world to appreciate that the original title of the book was supposed to be Punctured Romance, the films of Marie Dressler, which the press thought was too obscure, people wouldn't understand it. But I still kind of miss that title, because the thesis of the book is that all of Dressler's films, stretching into the 30s, were punctured romances of one kind or another, that it was her system to kind of take a genre and find the most sort of sentimental romantic aspects of that genre and then just poke holes in them through her physical performances that were so vigorous and powerful. So that's my entry into this conversation. I should tell you, I'm not a silent film expert in particular. I'm interested in Dressler silent films and the era, of course, but I'll obviously defer to the other panelists on all the little details of Senate and Keystone. And a lot of Dressler's most interesting films were made in the 1930s, when she had a kind of big revival and was actually the #1 box office draw in the country, 1931-32, as the Dressler Museum folk well know. So I can talk about her talkies a little bit also, if that's of any interest.
Sure. How did you discover Marie Dressler?
You know, I had a vague sense that she was there. I've worked on film comedy for quite some time, but it was Carrie Beauchamp's book on Frances Marion, Without Lying Down, that tells the story of how Frances Marion, the screenwriter, and Marie Dressler were kind of partners in crime at MGM in particular during the 30s, that particularly piqued my interest and made me want to kind of go back and look at Dressler as the central figure in her own little drama.
Wonderful. Happy to have you here.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Hi, Jason.
Hello.
This is Jason Allin. You may be familiar with him. He's been involved in many of the Chaplin events last year, virtually and in person at the Niles Film Museum. Jason, why don't you give us a little intro in case
Sure.
anyone's interested?
Yes, we'll see. I'm here in Canada right now, just north of Toronto, near Barrie, Ontario. And I have been hanging around with you guys for a while in Niles, and it's been my pleasure for sure. It's a very important part when you're working with Charlie Chaplin stuff, and very interested. And that is in my opinion, the North American hub for sure. If you want to know anything about Charlie Chaplin, at least just stand there. You'll get a lot of information, and
whether you want it or not, right?
Whether you want it or not, and it's coming at you. And I can't get enough of it. And I've been around the world doing what I do. I emulate the tramp character, and I perm my hair and color it black, so I look a little different right now. But it's been quite the ride, and I didn't expect to meet so many historians in my travel. I've met as many historians as just straight up fans, I think, and I would say 90% of them are from Niles area and here and so on. But doing some a national commercial in Japan, which was a really fantastic thing for me, working through the Chaplin office to get that one, and my visits to India, which has brought me to working with people who really absolutely adore the essence of Chaplin. And I think my offerings have tilted that way, more of the spirit of Chaplin within everyone, the artist in everyone, that magnetic thing that we see on film, the thing I've been studying for years, when I thought I was the only one on the planet of all time being that drawn to him, I realize I'm not, and people are still crazy for him. And in other countries, non-English speaking countries, for obvious reasons. And it's a fantastic journey. Yeah.
Thank you, Jason. And I'm interested to learn, because in this film, Charlie is not the tramp, but I sort of, when I was rewatching it today, it's sort of a situation where it's sort of like the great dictator character, where he's the barber. He's not the tramp, but he's still kind of the tramp.
Well, yeah,
even in Tillie's Punctured romance.
I would absolutely argue that it is the tramp. It isn't the tramp, but it certainly is the tramp, if you know what I mean. Because Charlie and the tramp are one and the same. You can't have one without the other, really. And it's really left up to a guy like me. I'd be just another actor doing the role of the tramp. I'm certainly not Charlie Chaplin. And it's like somebody else doing Indiana Jones, or 007, the role of 007, you know, and but a little different. Of course, it was owned by and created by Charlie Chaplin. You can't really have one with the other. So it is the tramp, in my opinion. The mannerisms, if you watch closely, they're so superbly there and well placed. And he knew his tramp character very well. This was the last of his Senate films. It's funny how the last of his Senate films was not of the tramp, and his first one was not of the tramp. So those are the only two that really weren't necessarily, as far as I know, you know, a beginning. Like,
unless he was playing that Ford Sterling character, which again is the tramp, just a different variation of him. But yeah, we'll get into that a little bit later, I guess.
Sure.
All right, Miss Cathie, you're up. About 2 hours from Jason, I learned, too. Not too far away.
Yes. I actually live about 10 miles north of where Marie Dressler was born, in the town of Coburg. Her house, the house she was born in, is the same as when it was built. It has had a small extension on the back. It has been a restaurant, but in the last few years, it's been turned into a museum. We were able to get master's students from the University of Toronto who were going through for museum studies to create it for us. And it's all with touch pads. It's pretty incredible. They're also now looking at adding in other Canadian stars like Norma Shearer, Mary Pickford, and maybe even looking at Marie Prevost, who are all Canadian, who all worked in early film. I worked for Universal Studios for about 30 years in the home entertainment division. So it started out with VHS and then DVD and then Blu-ray, and ultimately by the time I left, streaming. And I've always loved film. I think the first film I saw that I loved was a Marx Brothers film, Coconuts, and I still love it. But I got involved when I moved out here. I found out there was a film festival, and I got involved with that in 2009, and I still am with Vintage Film Festival and the Marie Dressler Foundation. I served on the board. Found out a lot about her life, a lot about her family. Her mother was a Henderson, Anna Henderson from Port Hope, which is a little town about 7 miles away from Coburg, further west. And the Henderson family is still very prominent in that town.
Very interesting.
Yeah. And so now I'm involved, as well as with Vintage Film, with another enterprise, helping young Canadian filmmakers to get their work marketed, edited, produced, and we're called Film Access Northumberland. So we're really trying to ramp up the Canadian film industry in Northumberland, where a ton of filmmakers live. They're all very quietly. Can't throw a rock without hitting one around here. Producers, directors, editors.
How did you discover Marie Dressler?
Well, I discovered her when I went to the Vintage Film Festival, because it's all based on raising money to maintain the house and to eventually turn it into a museum, which they did. So I'm sure, Victoria, you maybe have met Barbara Garrick. when you initially, yeah, she is kind of the Marie Dressler historian from Northumberland. She's a school teacher who just loves her. She met everybody, including Betty Lee, who wrote a book about Marie as well. And I sat at the feet of Barbara Garrick and learned all about Marie Dressler. Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, very happy to have you here. And honestly, I didn't know there was a Marie Dressler Museum. So
Yeah.
hopefully
Yeah,
all these Charlie fans. Yeah.
She only lived there for her very early childhood. And then by the time she was about 9 or 10, I believe she moved on up toward Lindsay and places like that in Ontario, and then eventually down into the US.
Very cool. And then we also have Rena here, over here somewhere. She's behind the scenes. She's working the Q&A and working the chat and everything. But I said if you had a question or anything, wanted to pop in or make a comment, she'd be welcome to do that as well. So.
Yep, I'm here.
You know Rena.
Hi.
Hi. All right, I guess we'll get started then. I want to just open this up to everyone. Do I hear someone? Oh, never mind. Sorry. I thought I heard someone talking. Anyway, so Tillie's Punctured Romance, basically, I guess I'll throw this to Brent, but we can kind of open the discussion. How did Sennett decide, A, that he wanted to make a feature-length comedy, and B, why did he pick Tillie's Nightmare, which was a stage play that Marie was in, to base this? Why did he think that would be the best idea for making a feature-length comedy film?
Well, first of all, the 1914, you present that the motion picture industry at that time, and this also applies with S&A and the other companies. It was short subjects. They weren't short subjects. That was the one reel. One reel was the standard length, and 2 reels a lot of times was a special. And there were feature films before this. There were in Europe. There had been feature films. In the U.S. there had been a couple, but the industry hadn't gone. I mean, D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation was a year after this. So Max Sennett's Keystone Studio started in 1912, and from 1912 to 1915, his distribution company was the Mutual Company, which, Chaplin, people who know Chaplin know that Chaplin later signed with Mutual proper 1916, 17, but Chaplin actually technically worked for Mutual twice because the Keystone films were being distributed by Mutual. And Sennett, as early as 1913, when he was making first what were called split reel films, they were like 5 minutes, and then 1 reel films, he started making 2 reelers pretty much on his own, and Mutual would actually tell him, like, stop doing that because we don't have, like, that's not part of our program, and is taking away from the 1 reelers. And I think the same thing happened in 1914. By 1914, he had convinced them, we could do 2 reel specials and still do the 1 reelers and do 2 reelers. He was always thinking ahead. So the decision to make Tillie was something that he did on his own, not through, it ended up taking away from, like, he fell behind in providing Mutual with the 1 reelers and 2 reelers that they wanted, particularly since all the main people, except for Roscoe Arbuckle, were in this film, who all had, Mabel had a film unit, Chaplin had a unit, some of the other people that were doing things. So, Sennett was always attuned, since he had started on Broadway as a chorus boy in 1902 to 1908 before he joined the Biographs film studio, where he met D.W. Griffith and eventually was an actor and became a director. He was always attuned to the stage talent. He may have known Marie Dressler back then, so.
Yeah, he picked Charlie off the stage when he was with Carno.
And Charlie was on one type of, he knew vaudeville, he knew the, English, the Carno company, but he also knew the legitimate theater people. And a year after this, when he signed with Triangle, that's when he really started signing all those Broadway comedians to come west. Marie Dressler was really the first that was, you know, the big name on Broadway. So I think Sennett, I don't know that he was specifically as much signing, you know, Tillie's Nightmare, that was a name play, but I think what he really wanted was Marie Dressler, and then he wanted to make one of his comedies on a large scale, you know, which is why it ended up bearing little resemblance to Tillie's Nightmare. But he also wanted to get all, you know, his comedians, his character players, the Keystone Cops into the mix, and of course Chaplin and Mabel, who were, you know, two of his biggest stars.
That's what I was going to say. This film is sort of a greatest hits package of everything that Keystone was known for up until that time. Charlie, Mabel, Arbuckle isn't in it, but he's in a poster in the background, I noticed today. So I was like, well, he's, you know, there's sort of a little Easter egg for him in there. And I highly doubt the Keystone Cops showed up at the end of Tillie's Nightmare, the stage play. I kind of figured that,
yeah,
you know.
And if you watch some of the Keystones made during this time, including Arbuckle, like there's an Arbuckle film where you see him use some of the same sets that are in this, you know, appear like I think the Knockout even maybe have, but so they were sort of shooting around the regular schedule to make this film, and it was sort of a start and stop also because of, you know, other issues, you know, related to Marie and but it was sort of, it's hard to say that he made this on the sly, but there wasn't like a, hey, we're Max Sennett's making a feature film, his next feature film is going to be star Marie Dressler. He was doing this because he wanted to do it, and he was convinced, you know, the motion picture industry at this time was a little bit backward because there was still the Motion Picture Trust headed by Edison, and that was, you know, most of the companies that started making feature films weren't those companies. They were the future companies like Paramount, Art, you know, Famous Players Lasky, and you know, some of the ones that were, you know, like the Squaw Man and things where it was like, you know, no, this is the future. You know, those were the independent companies that weren't part of the trust that were doing that kind of a thing. So it was sort of breaking the mold to even try to make a feature film because they thought for sure, you know, audiences won't sit for this.
Well, that was going to be my next question too, because as a classic Disney fan, this parallels Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs in my mind, as far as Walt Disney thinking, well, not him thinking it, but the critics saying no one's going to watch a feature-length cartoon. No one has the attention span to watch a cartoon for more than 10 minutes. And I have to wonder if a similar idea was going through Sennett's head at the time. Our audience is going to be able to sustain laughter for 90 minutes or 80 minutes or whatever it is. But obviously he had faith in his crew that he can make that happen. And I think he was successful in that.
Yeah. And even despite that, he would still pretty much, for the 20 years or 21 years of Sennett Studios, he would make features, but his bread and butter was, you know, at one point it became all two-reelers, like with a lot of the comedy, but he would make features and have some success, some not a success, but he always had the distribution of his shorts, which became part of the program when they started making, you know, features with shorts as, you know, and newsreels, etc. So,
are you aware of any sort of conflict as far as when Sennett brought in Marie Dressler? Was there any sort of jealousy as far as Charlie or Mabel or any of the Sennett cast thinking, why is this outsider coming in to be a star of the films that we're all stars in? Or was there sort of a love relationship there? Did they respect her as a stage actress, and did they enjoy working with her?
You know, I don't have like specific indications, but I think in general, if there was jealousies, it was more had to do with money. Like for sure, a year later, 1915, when he started Triangle and had a big influx of cash and was able to sign, you know, Eddie Foy and Weber and Fields and all of these, and pay them more than the people that were had been making films for 2 or 3 years for them. There was some jealousy, but I think, you know, from what I've seen, I mean, it seemed like they kind of, everyone knew each other and kind of was, you know, happy to see her, and that more won out. So I you know.
And this question is really for everyone. When Marie came into the crew and started working on this film, does anybody have any background or stories on how she gelled with the cast?
I would say that, I mean, Dressler's participation really helped ensure Sennett's big risk in making the film. I mean, it was a risk to make a feature-length comedy film, but you know, the other factor is he had Marie Dressler, and she was very well known, and the Tillie character was very well known nationally at the time. And you know, if you see the restoration of the film, very different from the previously kind of chopped up versions of it that had been in circulation for so many generations. Dressler is the star, you know, her name's on all the title cards, Marie Dressler and Tillie's Punctured Romance. And the film opens and closes with her in front of a curtain, you know, that's opening and closing as if it is a stage show. And so it's clear that Sennett understood that her star power is a big chunk of what's going to put this over in a way that sort of might not be visible without that lens of history.
Was she excited to jump into filmmaking, or was this something they kind of had to coax her into?
Yeah, she was interested in making a film. It was her first film. She also knew Sennett, considered him a fellow Canadian. She was always proud of being a Canadian. When she won her Academy Award, she talked in the Academy Awards that she was born in Cobourg. But she also liked Chaplin very much and admired him. She claims she hired him into the part because she didn't want Roscoe, because she didn't want another large comedic actor to compete with her. So she chose Charlie because he was little and slight and would be perfect in the comic role that she wanted him to play. Her name was not only well known in North America, also in Britain, which was important to Sennett because I guess, you know, with the people who bought the reels, that was important in Britain as well. I found in Charlie's 1969 autobiography that he only mentions Dressler twice. And the first time is on page 158. And he said, I had several successful pictures under my belt, and he names them. And during this time, Mabel and I starred in a feature with Marie Dressler. It was pleasant to work with Marie, but I do not think the picture had much merit. And he doesn't name the title of the film either. And the other time he mentions her is on page 213, and that's when they were doing the Liberty Bond drive. And when he was doing his, you know, against the Germans, buy Liberty Bonds, and he actually flew off the stage, grabbed her, and they both landed on top of the fellow that was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Franklin D. Roosevelt, at the time. And both of them fell on top. But that's the only time he mentions Marie. But they were 20 years apart in age as well. And he was a forward-thinking individual, and I think he thought her comedic style was like old vaudeville, right? Yeah.
Jason, you have anything to add?
Yeah, it's certainly not a classic Chaplin film because it doesn't immediately contain the tramp, and people might not look at it as being one of those films. And it does say Marie Dressler's name all over it, right from the beginning. She's got a grand opening curtain call almost, and a grand ending curtain call type bow out. It's all about her, and she's in every title card, basically, in every section, every reel. It doesn't really say much about Chaplin that way, and you got to wonder what were the egos like at that time. I don't know. I'm certainly not a historian, but when you watch the film as a fan, and you know in context where the tramp character was worldwide, how powerful he was at that, right in 1914. and beyond. And that being the end of Mac's Sennett contract, you got to wonder, was there an ego situation there? Why would her name be there so big? Of course, I don't know the great details. I'm sure Brent might be able to fill that in better for me. But and then to not use the tramp character, you'd almost wonder, why didn't they write in the tramp in the storyline, considering that was one of the aces that they had? Or was it too late? I don't know. Was it already promised to Essanay now, or to his New Horizon, whatever it may be? Yeah.
The thing is that this really, I mean, I think they started filming around in June, I think 14. So at that point, Chaplin, you would have seen the films that he was shooting up, actually shooting through like, March or April, whatever. So he was starting to get popular, but he wasn't, I think maybe over the course that Tillie was made, from the beginning to the shooting to the end, because there was like about a 3-month period of off and on shooting. By the end, I think he was a lot more popular than when he started, so it's at that point, it wasn't, necessarily like, oh, that we're going to do the tramp. I mean, maybe by the end of when they were shooting, they would have like, oh, we would have done this with the tramp, but maybe he wanted to. I mean, you mentioned earlier Making a Living, his first film. I mean, this film, he also has like the pencil mustache, but he's also playing sort of more the cad character that he would later do in some films, whatever, like the count, whatever, with the putting on airs. But by that time, it was doing everything with the tramp. But it seemed like maybe he wanted to reserve the tramp for a certain type of person, a certain type of character. And if he was playing somebody that, was a little bit more, either was a little higher, from a higher strata, or wanted to.
Yeah, there's really no redeeming qualities to the City Slicker. He's the straight up villain. There's no redeeming qualities for him. So I was wondering if perhaps, even though the tramp obviously at that time had his issues, as far as being violent or being aggressive in the Keystone era, at the end of the day, he was still sort of an all right kind of guy. And the City Slicker in Tillie is just the villain of he steals from everybody. He screws over Mabel, and he screws over Tillie, and he lies to her to lie to her to steal that money. So I'm even wondering if then the seeds were being planted in Charlie's head, thinking, I want to preserve the tramp to be something more than just this. So maybe I'll put it aside.
Yeah,
and film.
Knowing, if putting yourself back into that time, and Sennett's Keystone films, one thing that when approaching them today, you need to know a little bit about the times and the film and the stage motifs that were standard. Like, you'll see a lot of Keystone films where he spoofs specific films of his mentor, D.W. Griffith, but he also, both with, Ford Sterling, who played, a villain character all the times, and there were stage melodrama motifs, and one of the most common ones was, the farmer's daughter, the city slicker, her country lover, and Sennett used that plot so many times, even prior to this and after this. So, and that was a common thing with Sennett, where he would kind of fall back sometimes on what the things he knew that he did, the stories. So I think that was just the natural thing. So for Chaplin, he may have like, okay, well, this, I'm just going to go for doing the city slicker character as it's been done, the sort of pencil mustache guy, I mean, you kept seeing this up through, Tex Avery cartoons and on into perpetuity of the cliches of the smooth talking city slicker. So that he probably saw it that way, that, okay, this, I'm doing a character in this, I'm not doing what I, would want to do. So
2 questions before we move on real fast. I've been thinking about Roscoe Arbuckle, And someone mentioned before about why he wasn't paired up with Marie as a lead in the film, but I'm surprised they didn't give him a cameo or something to do in the film, considering at that time he was just as big as Charlie and Mabel. I wonder if he was, I mean, obviously okay with that because he was working for Senate, but I wonder how he felt if he wasn't asked to be a part of that big project. And the second question, were theaters apprehensive to book Tillie because it was 6 reels, it was a feature-length film? Did they think they could pull people in to see this film? This is for anybody.
Well, on the second question, I mean, I all I know about, I don't know the specifics of why there's not even a cameo, other than one thing I know is the story about Marie not wanting Arbuckle in the film because, you know, she didn't want another large comedian to take it away. So maybe it was her call. I don't know. But this film, it took a little bit to get it to the theaters because there was a company formed called Alco, which actually involves a number of people who were later on became big in the movie industry. There was, you know, I think Marcus Lowe and the guy Al Lichtman that was Alco was an MGM late in the 30s, a big MGM executive, 20s and 30s. So the Skink brothers were involved, like, you know, because it was exhibitors. Basically, in this time in the motion picture industry, there was either the companies that were the trust companies, but the other people that got involved in making films, a lot of times in forming studios or forming distribution, were theater exhibitors that were saying, you know, I can make pictures better than what I'm seeing that I'm showing in my studio, my theaters here in Boston or Chicago or whatever. So that's, but they formed this company, Alco, and there were, right from the bat, they had some problems with it and it went under. So then it was, I think Mutual ended up picking it up, but it took a little bit because there wasn't a distribution channel, a clear-cut distribution channel for feature films yet. You know, so soon some of even the companies like Vitagraph and SNA, within a year or two, that were, you know, the established companies started making features, but it was, you know, it was a completely new game of how you would get, you know, 6 reels of 35 millimeter film, you know, how many prints and, you know, all that kind of a thing. So I can imagine, you know, there were a lot of roadblocks and hiccups to getting it, but once it was before the theaters, it was a success.
This is sort of a Marie Dressler question. Once she was on set at Keystone, is there any interesting stories, behind the scenes stories of the making of the film? Did she enjoy being on camera? Obviously she enjoyed that, but as far as adapting to making film is such a different atmosphere than being on the stage. As far as her relationship with Mabel and Charlie and Senate, at the end of the day, was it obviously the movie made a lot of money, I'm sure she did too, but was that for the most part, positive experience for her working with Keystone?
And it couldn't have been that positive since they didn't work together anymore after. But I don't know that the problems were necessarily on set. From everything I've read, it seems that the filming went fine, but this was an era of Dressler's career when she was having trouble working with producers in a way. She was always kind of too big for the kind of role of just, you know, go to work and do what the director tells you kind of thing. And so, like Chaplin, she was starting to really want to run her own shows in different kinds of ways and looking for new kinds of opportunities to be the star with more creative control over what all was going on. Unfortunately, she also had a husband who was something, he was at best a bad manager and at worst a crook, Jim Dalton, Sonny Jim, who seemed to kind of poison a lot of her professional relationships in ways it's not always clear what role Dressler had in the conversations relative to him. So after Tillie's Punctured Romance, she made 2 more Tillie movies, but with totally different studios each time. And then she tried to create the Marie Dressler Picture Company and kind of ended up in Nowheresville after this. But I don't think the problem was adapting her comedy style to the screen. It seems audiences really loved her. And when she was working with quality production crews, she was producing really interesting work. I think the problem was mostly the business model of pictures at the time, and her own personal circumstances kind of quickly led to some issues with trying to get it out there. Cathie, do you have anything about backstage?
I think your mic is off.
Cathie,
I can't hear Cathie's microphone.
Cathie, we know it's going to be fascinating, but you got to turn your mic on.
Sorry, yeah.
See, it's in playing with Tillie. It's a silent.
We're getting a storm, so I keep going in and out. But anyway, Marie was a pleasant woman. She particularly liked to help younger women in film, especially those that weren't in prominent positions. She really liked Mabel Normand. I really like Mabel Normand. I watched this film, Tillie's Punctured Romance. We showed it at our festival in 2018 because it was Marie's 150th birthday. But Mabel Normand, in this scene in Tillie's Punctured Romance, where she has the pince-nez and she's looking through it, sitting on the bench with Charlie, and she's crossing her eyes and looking at it, I thought, oh my God, who does she remind me of? She reminds me of Terry Garr. And I love Terry Garr. And so I think Marie, she found it a pleasant experience, except when after it was made and her husband got involved and they ended up suing because they thought they weren't getting everything that they were supposed to get. And then it ended up that they were. And maybe that kind of wasn't a great ending with Sennett. But
Cathie, I want to build on that because I think you made such an important point about Marie and Mabel. And I think you can see it in the film. Dressler always had all this solidarity with other women, on screen and behind the scenes. And the way that the film ends, not with Mabel and Charlie, back together the way you expect, but rather with the 2 women embracing each other. It's not a romantic ending. It's an anti-romantic ending, but it's an ending that emphasizes this female solidarity. That's really rare in together. What's that, Cathie?
Yeah, that's what girls do when they get hurt, right? They go off with their gal pal.
I think you can sort of see their own voices in that aspect of the film. I think it's very Dressler.
You mentioned Mabel being connected with Terry Garr. I always looked at Mabel as I always looked at Julie Louis-Dreyfus as a modern day Keystone Mabel. If you watch her on Seinfeld and maybe not so much Veep, but her Elaine Bennis character, which is also from New York area, I always feel like if Mabel was living in the 90s, that would have been her. The same sort of, rambunctious, and she can hang with the guys, but she can also be a girl. She can also be a lady when the time calls for that. So whenever I was introduced to those films, and the Mabel Normand films especially as a kid, I was born and bred on Seinfeld. So I'm like, she's kind of like Elaine. That was my my entry point there.
Well, I definitely want to watch more of her films. I really enjoyed her performance.
Absolutely. Oh yeah, there's a lot of Mabel out there, and the more Mabel films you see, the more you like her. Yeah,
I have to say, I'm being someone who studied so close all the mannerisms of Charlie Chaplin that I possibly could. I mean, he has this very strict patterns, but there's not an awful lot of people that can go up against him and still be so magnetic. She definitely is one, and it's set up for you for sure. So you wonder, oh, is that because it's got her name on the title and so on? But no, the performance is so. She really works with the camera really well. You could tell her stage training is there, and that's where Chaplin got his from. Right from day one, he was doing stage stuff. Right from his first movies, you just go to what you know by the look of it, and he does it right up to the end of his career on film, on camera, and it's just muscle memory for him, and it really looks like it is for her too. She does slapstick for, anybody of that size doing slapstick. You have to do it a certain way too, and same with Chaplin. He's a small frame, and he has his own forte in the way slapstick works. So she's a master at it, and I'm sure Chaplin knew that and worked it very well. I'm sure he's worked with somebody like her before, but on stage, I mean, he knows how to work the difference in contrast of people's sizes. He's good at it.
Cathie and Victoria, if you're not 100% up on Chaplin, an interesting tidbit is that when Charlie entered the movies, Mabel was actually the one that helped him adapt from the stage to the screen. I feel like that gets left out of a lot of the biographies, but Charlie wanted to quit Keystone not too long into working for them, and there was a huge blow up. And of course, if you watch the Robert Downey Jr. film, it makes it look like they were enemies on set all the time. And, they had their differences just like anybody else. Of course, for a film, they want to play that up. But at the end of the day, Mabel really helped Charlie. Mabel convinced Charlie to stay at Keystone. And Mabel assisted Charlie when he wasn't comfortable at first in front of the camera. So in and of itself, that alone, makes her a very important figure. And even though she wasn't credited, she directed a lot of her early films as well.
Now, I wanted to say that's really specifically, I think the friction they had was not as a performer or personal, but her as the director. And I think it had more to do with Chaplin's, kind of Victorian sensibilities about a woman being in charge or something, plus his wanting to be in charge because he already had the ideas flowing. But I also wanted to amend, like earlier I had said, they started shooting this in June. It actually was finished in June. It was begun in April. So when they started shooting it in April, Chaplin had only had a few films on the screen. By the time he finished, in June, and by the time the film was edited in July, he was getting a little bit bigger. By the time audience didn't start seeing it until like December. So by the time it was released, he was enormous. So there was the time lapse of when it was shot to when it was released. Chaplin's stature, if Chaplin in December had been the Chaplin in April, Sennett might have made a feature film with Chaplin. That's just how things changed.
Well, if you look at any re-release of Tillie after 1914, outside of them cropping everything out, a lot of the Marie stuff is just cropped out, and it's Charlie Chaplin is a star of the film. Mm-hmm. Even the versions I grew up with until that restoration came out, the scenes of Marie with the curtain and everything and her getting introduced, that was all cut out, and it opens with Charlie's back. So it's interesting to see how, as the eras go by and how that film was re-edited and re-released over the years, more and more of Marie got cut out, and more of Chaplin's bits just became the focus of the film.
Mm-hmm. One other thing I wanted to add, because we were talking about, Chaplin working with a large female comedian. I mean, actually at Keystone, one of his frequent co-stars or supporting players, actually prior to Tillie and after, was Phyllis Allin, who actually would continue off and on with Chaplin going into the 20s in his films. And even though Phyllis Allin wasn't the comedian that Mabel Normand was, but she was a great comedian, but also more coming from as a supporting actress, a veteran actress, and he had a good interplay with her. So I think that might have, led into working with Marie, where he was already doing some similar things, but in a different, where more like Phyllis Allen would play his henpecking wife, and he'd be flirting with a Mabel or another like young, beautiful actress kind of thing. So,
as a side note too, I love the fact that in this film, Charlie and Mabel go to see a Keystone film. That might even be my favorite scene of the whole movie, because it's almost a documentary now. I would assume the theater, the Nickelodeon, is a set, but I think the outside is a real theater with real movie posters outside.
Yeah, and Keystone, they did a number of those where it usually like they would map the screen, and then project, because Senate's crew was doing some early matte work, going back. But yeah, in the film, of course, you have Charlie Chase, the future Charlie Chase, who's old Charlie Parrott, is in that. And there's another guy, Morgan Wallace, who 20 years later was with W.C. Fields and It's a Gift, the guy who wants, kumquats. So there's like all these people in this film, and you look through all the, Al St. John, Edgar Kennedy, Hank Mann, all these future comedians, some future dramatic players who, went on to big things. So that's so many people started with Senate. And so he would sometimes get people, big names, Marie Dressler being like the biggest to date when he did this, but then also people who were not really well known, but would go on to big things.
I don't know if anybody really has the answer to this question, but I wonder when the earliest film was that actually showed the inside of a movie theater. I know Film Johnny has it, but I'm even thinking prior to Chaplin.
For instance, D.W. Griffith made, and Senate's in this, like 1909, Those Awful Hats. It's all about women wearing like, big hats to the theaters, but I'm sure that like that was 1909, and I'm sure it goes way back to either whether it was an actual theater or, I'm sure Malaise would have to look, but it probably wouldn't have been a theater, but it would have been a backdrop that made to look like a theater.
The earliest one I know of is Uncle Josh at the Moving Picture Show from 1902.
Wow.
Which is an Edwin S. Porter film.
I'll have to check that out. I love that kind of self-referential stuff.
Yeah, and Senate liked to do, there's several of his films, including several with Chaplin, where they're outside of the movie theater, and they always have the Keystone posters for another Keystone film, so.
And that really helps date when when those scenes were shot too, depending on what posters are outside.
Mm-hmm.
I noticed too, someone mentioned on Facebook a couple weeks ago, and I made note of it too, because I was working on this back then. The costume that Charlie wears in the middle of the film is, I think, the same costume he wears in Mabel's Busy Day. Same hat, same coat. He's got the boutonniere over there. Mm-hmm. So not to say they couldn't hang on to these outfits for more than a year, but I also wonder if those particular scenes were shot around the same time as Mabel's Busy Day.
Yeah, could be.
I don't think they were thinking really too hard about the costumes and all that back then, whatever they had available at that time.
Yeah, because you picture during the time they're shooting this, Charlie's maybe spending a few days shooting a picture, and they're shooting scenes around him. Maybe he comes back and they're shooting one, Mabel's starring in something, the ones where Mabel and Charlie are together, obviously they're not shooting anything, but some, they're bringing in people who just came off of maybe making a one-reeler, and then like they put them in a restaurant scene, or someone like Chester Conklin, or, so it's all, that's I think what was going on here, because it was about a 2-month or so period, and
Dressler loved costumes, and loved hats. She loved having crazy hats for her characters, and you can see it in a lot of her films. But I think this is a masterpiece, this one where she's got the bird on her head and the stuff on the side. I mean, she needed those costumes in order to create the character, and then she really uses them. You know, she's always fiddling with her sleeves or putting her apron in her mouth, and so she claims, I mean, it's you always have to take with a grain of salt things that are in fan magazines or star autobiographies, but she claims she made her own hats and picked out her costumes and things very carefully. But I find it plausible because they really were part of the job for her. She knew she could do the characters better if the costume was absurd in exactly the right way.
Yeah, and it seems
comparing. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Brent.
I was just gonna say, like, there was one of was it Tillie Wakes Up, one of the later films she did on the East Coast, where, you know, she was sort of doing similar hats. So I'm assuming that was the Tillie. She kind of envisioned that as the Tillie character, certain outfits related to that character.
Later, when she was in Anna Christie with Greta Garbo in 1930-31, one of the reviewers mentioned how her character's kind of broken down, crumpled hat kind of makes, you know, right away kind of her whole history. And Dressler like shot back in an interview. It was really funny. She said, you know, I don't know what they're talking about. That's my own hat. But she I think it was her own hat, but I also think she chose it because that was her thing.
Comparing the stage show Tillie to the film, how much leeway did Sennett take as far as the storyline?
Well, he changed it from a Cinderella story to a rich country girl with an abusive father, basically. Yeah.
So she has kind of miserable home life either way. I was never able to find a screenplay or anything for the original. So I only had descriptions of Tillie's Nightmare from, you know, reviews in the press at the time. I don't know if Cathie knows of any better source materials. So all I think that's really known is that Tillie's sisters go off to a party and she's left home alone to clean, and she falls asleep and then she has crazy dreams. And I do think that the sort of country girl goes wild in the city. I'm sorry? Seem like they might be similar to the crazy dreams. I mean, you know, some drunken dancing, some wildness, getting arrested. I wonder how much of that could have been imported from the kind of fantasy sequences of the original. But I don't think, I'm not aware of any really good sources that would tell us more about the scene by scene breakdown of Tillie's Nightmare.
Mabel Normand, when she began starting with Mickey to star in feature films, she ended up doing a number of Cinderella story that became sort of a favorite situation to put her in a lot of those features, the Senate and the Goldwyn, and so.
But I think that Tillie character is pretty consistent, right? She's used to housework, she's naive, she doesn't know anything, and then when she gets the opportunity to kind of go wild, she has this sort of, I find, a very endearing, enthusiastic reactions to everything, and I think that's the essence of the Tillie concept.
A couple of little side notes I have here. Can everyone hear me? I think my internet went weird for a second. Everyone good? Okay. A couple of notes I wrote down during the scene where Charlie and Tillie first go into the city. Apparently that, and they're dodging the cars and everything. Apparently that was shot on Hollywood Boulevard.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Hollywood and Cahuenga.
Yeah. Oh yeah, Brent, if you want to get into maybe a couple notes on where some of the scenes were shot, that'd be a cool little tidbit. Obviously at the Keystone Studio, but I think they went to Santa Monica Pier for the end.
Yeah, that was either Santa Monica or it could have been Venice or the Ocean Park. I think actually not the Santa Monica, but yeah, and the farm was a studio, like it was called Brown's Ranch, and it later became known as Mixville when Tom Mix used it earlier. But it was located near, like, sort of just between the Senate Studio and Griffith Park, on a hill in sort of Los Feliz, Silver Lake area that's, you know, now completely covered with houses. But it was, you know, they had that little Senate used that a few times, where they had the little house in Western. They built a Western, but at some point when there's that great shot where, like, the dirt road and you see, like, kind of the mountain, Griffith Park in the background, and some of that wasn't, you know, that wasn't too far from the Keystone Studio over in Edendale Echo Park. So often, and also the Schlosser's Castle San Souci, which was that opulent mansion in Hollywood that I think was torn down like 1929, but there was several other Keystone and Senate and other films shot there, but that made a great you know, wealthy mansion. And it was intentionally, the Schlosser who built it was German descent, and he kind of made it a Germanic, you know, architecture. So it looks like somewhere else other than, you know, Hollywood at the time. But yeah, the pier was a frequent thing, and I think it was sort of like, oh, how are we going to end this? Let's throw the Keystone Cops in, and which always, when people talk about the Keystone Cops, they sort of became more legendary than they necessarily were prominent than they actually were in the Keystone films, because usually they were just at the end called in when there was, you know, mayhem broke loose, and they came and were more mayhem. And in this film, it's sort of like, I mean, Marie Dressler, in the pier scenes, it's as though she'd been doing Keystone films for, you know, a year or two, because she literally fell right into it, as far as, you know, going over the railings and falling down, going off into the drink, and
I love it when she slaps the fish. Isn't that just so
And the
great?
crab, yeah.
It's not the fish's fault, but it's so beautiful.
I was listening to my buddy interned for a local radio station a while back, and they've been on the air for 25 years, and they've been doing interviews with people from all walks of life, and they were playing some retro interviews that they conducted, you know, years and years ago, and I happened to catch one they did with Milton Berle. So Milton's talking about his time in the entertainment industry and everyone he's met and everyone he's worked with. And he starts talking about Tillie's Punctured Romance. And he's going, you know, I was the paper boy in Tillie's Punctured Romance. I worked with Mabel Normand. I worked with Charlie Chaplin. He had this whole long story about how, you know, Charlie kept having to hit him with the newspaper, and how his mom got upset. His mom wasn't as sad, and this. And I'm listening to this story. I'm thinking, I've never heard this. Milton Berle is in Tillie's Punctured Romance. That doesn't sound right. So, I mean, this interview had to be from probably the late 90s or so, maybe mid 90s. So I'm Googling, I'm like, that was Gordon Griffith is the paper boy in Tillie's Punctured Romance. So I'm thinking, why would he go to this great length to make this huge lie about a film from 1914? It's just, but he knew Mabel Normand, he knew Chaplin, he knew the scene. But it's a complete fabrication.
Well,
interesting.
I think what I've learned, and my good friend Steve Mazza, I don't know if he's listening now, because everything about it except for the title of the film and Chaplin may be correct, because you know, of course, this was filmed on the West Coast. Berle was on the East Coast, and when Marie came back to films, it was on the East Coast. And there is a film called The Scrub Lady, which I was one time at Library of Congress and watching, and Steve was watching a show. There's a scene in that where there's a little boy, and it looks like it could be Milton Berle as a little boy. So he may indeed be in a Marie Dressler film, but it wasn't Tillie. Of course, when people remember things, they always remember, you know, the greatest thing. Like every kid actor, there were kid actors, and there were all these imitations of our gang. But you know, they always, well, I was a member of our gang. Well, it's actually you were in the, you know, McDougal Alley Kids or whatever. But so I think, you know, part of that might be his mother's memories of, oh yeah, you were in Tillie's Punctured Romance because Marie Dressler was so famous, and Tillie's Punctured Romance and Tillie was so famous. But I don't know if Victoria or Cathie have any verification of that, but that's kind of from Steve's theory, that it was actually another film shot on the East Coast that he was remembering, or his mother was later told him that he worked with, you know, Tillie's Punctured Romance, because it's definitely Gordon Griffith, who's the kid in that, the newsboy. And
it's good to have this backstory, because I was wondering why in the closing credits of the restoration it says Milton Berle, despite some reports, Milton Berle was not in the cast of this film.
Yeah,
and I thought, well, I never heard that rumor to begin with.
Amongst silent comedy fans, there's like sort of like, it's always been sort of a running joke about Milton Berle, you know, because it's obviously not him. We knew who it was, and it just didn't make sense of him being in there. But it appears he might have been within a Marie Dressler film. It just wasn't, as a boy, it just wasn't this one.
So I guess we're at about an hour here, so maybe we should try to start wrapping things up if you'd like. Arena, are there any questions in the Q&A we'd like to highlight, or do you have anything to add?
Oh, well, you guys are doing just great on your own. So a couple comments that have been made. This was early on, so I apologize if it's out of line, but you guys were all on your own thing here. One set from The Fatal Mallet is visible in Tillie. Michael Bonham said, didn't Chaplin also play a CAD type role in Making a Living? Because I think you were talking about.
Yeah, we mentioned that one, because that was the other pencil mustache.
Okay.
You know, the earlier character, and that this, you know, really was maybe 4 months after that. So after he filmed that, he started doing this. So it was, and he may not have yet been like, oh, this is my character, because there's also that recently discovered thief catcher from the early part of 1914 where he's playing a Keystone cop and he doesn't have a mustache. You know, he was still also doing like A Busy Day and some of the ones in drag where he wasn't. So
Mabel at the wheel.
At the point he was making this, he wasn't exclusively the tramp character on screen. So I think,
but like Jason was saying, there's no escaping the tramp. Even when even when he's playing a completely different character, those tramp sensibilities are still there.
Yeah, I mean, there's no escaping the Chaplin sensibility, the Chaplin body movements, the Chaplin approach to comedy. It just so happened when he got started, he whatever the story you want to believe about how the misfitting clothes and the mustache and whatever came about, it could have happened at a different place at a slightly different time, and he would have gotten different clothes, a different mustache. You would have still gotten that you know, unique person who moved that unique way and did his style the unique way that he did. You know, you couldn't really, you know, escape it. It was destined to come out, you know, in whatever costume he chose, I think.
Well, also I have a Dominique from France. It's 2:00 in the morning, or maybe 3
wow.
at this point. So I want to.
That's a true fan right there.
That's what I'm saying. The other Zooms we have are kinder to the European audience starting tomorrow, but we wanted to get this in on a Friday. He says the peer is visible in his new profession. So that's all I got here. So let's see.
Can I mention, there's a terrific question in the chat.
Yes.
For Cathie about, Karen Owen asks the panelists, when I was able to see the restoration with an audience, the Burrow credit and Chaplin's Falls and Butt Kicking got great laughing reactions, but no reaction to Marie Dressler, even her comic dance. Was there a better reception for Marie when the film was shown at Coburg? Now I want to know too.
Well, I saw the premiere at the Academy because I was one of the people that helped them with just locating stuff and what did it. And I thought it was an interesting decision in the restoration, actually a great decision, to include the real change titles in there. And when it played on the premiere, I mean, everything got an amazing response. Charlie, Marie, Mabel, everything that happened. And the audience was applauding for every time it was, you know, Tillie's Punctured Romance, you know, Reel 2, like, you know, so I think I've seen it a few times with audiences, and it seems like it actually went over, I think with the restoration, goes over better than the versions that have played for years, because you can kind of see more of like, okay, and when they come out for their, you know, curtain calls and things, you know, it just, I think everything about that, when you finally see that, it, you know, it gives more life to the people that, you know, these are people do, you know, the actual people playing these roles, you know, who became great people that in history of film comedy, and but here they are just, you know, coming out and saying hi.
Regarding that restoration, my jaw hit the floor when that curtain opened up at the end, and I had no clue that was ever a part of the film. All the versions I had ever seen were so chaotic and such bad quality, but that shot at the end of Charlie and Mabel and Marie coming out, I was just blown away. And that was actually a question I had. Were those scenes in any other version that were available up until the restoration?
A lot of that, I think the BFI had that beautiful 35 millimeter, but it was John Hampton, the Silent Movie Theater in Los Angeles, who had that print, I think it's 16 millimeter print, who was the only one I think that had that complete, there were some of the curtain call in the 35, but not all, and some of the beginning, and but he had that, you know. So you know, when I was a kid, we went there a few times to see comedy shorts. I never saw Tillie there, but I guess whoever would have seen Tillie at the Silent Movie Theater when John Hampton was running it, you know, up through the like 1980 or whatever, would have seen that. And I know people who did, you know, I didn't until it was incorporated into that restoration.
So I guess we'll try to wrap things up here. Cathie and Victoria. Oh, go ahead. You got something else to say?
I really want to know from Cathie if when the restoration shows in Coburg, people respond more strongly to Dressler.
Yeah, no, we have our patrons give us as much feedback as they can and rate our films. And of course, we're showing a variety of films. In the year that it was Marie, and we did show that film, it wasn't as popular maybe as some of the other later films of hers, are more highly rated. Actually, the comments that I remember on that film were about Chaplin, and it was not his pratfalls or his physical comedy, but more the play of emotions on his face. When he's sitting on the bench and the paper boy taps him, and his eyes look like pennies, like he's so frightened. That is what they picked up more on Chaplin in that film than Marie, actually.
You know, something I wanted to add about female comedians is 1915 at Keystone, which was after this film and after Dressler, Sennett hired Polly Moran, who was with him for several years as one of his stars. And of course, at the end of the 20s, she teamed up with Marie Dressler for a lot of films, both silent and then sound, and were a great team. It's just kind of coincident how all these people's careers and lives intertwined, or they missed each other here, but then they work together later. But it's also sort of like Marie and Mabel working together. Marie and Polly worked well together in a different way. So there's, yeah.
And speaking of intertwined, Marie Dressler's career after Tillie's Punctured Romance. So she made a couple Tillie films that I don't think they did quite as well as Tillie's Punctured Romance, but they were out there. And then once that kind of died down, as far as I know, as much as I know about Marie Dressler, she really didn't hit her stride again until the talkies.
Well, I like her in The Patsy or The Callahans and the Murphys is Lost. We don't get to see it. I think she yeah.
Yeah, I agree. And it was Bringing Up Father.
She's great in the talkies. I'll give her that. And certainly that's when her star really rose again, and she ended up with an Oscar and all the other accolades of her later career.
So folks that wanted to know more about Marie Dressler, outside of visiting the museum, which they should, and we'll include a link and all that to the museum and Victoria's book, obviously, where would be the best place to start outside of Tillie's Punctured Romance for somebody that wanted to learn more about the films of Marie Dressler?
Well, you can watch the films. Most of them are available now. They're on the Warner DVDs. I don't know if they've discontinued those. But I think
Christopher Bean is not available.
no.
Yeah, but everything
Yeah.
else pretty much is. Yeah.
Yeah. If you're new to Dressler, I think Min and Bill is a really good place to start, or Tugboat Annie. They're both really, really great stories. If you want to do the deep cuts, Emma and the two she made with Polly Moran in the 30s, Politics and Reducing, I think are both great fun. I think Politics is probably my favorite overall. It's
Mine
about
too.
Yeah.
I agree.
Do you? She runs for mayor and the women go on strike. It's kind of a Lysistrata sort of story about the women taking over the town in a way that seems like a fulfillment of some of the promise of Dressler as a sort of powerful woman who's just disrupts the whole world by being in it. That's kind of visible, I think, in all of her films.
Did anyone else have any questions or comments? Everyone else okay? All right. Rena, you good?
You bet.
All right. I just want to make sure. I don't want to cut anybody off if they had anything else to say. Well, thank you.
Yeah, I just want to plug, our upcoming Zooms that are going to be happening in the next 2 days. If you look at our website, nilesfilmmuseum.org, it gives you a whole schedule and all the Zooms. So we'll be seeing some of you folks in the next day or two. Jason's going to be there tomorrow. And then Nigel will be back on Sunday, as well as Jason. So I thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. We've watched this film all our lives as Chaplin fans. It's been kind of an oddity for a lot of people. So it's really fun to dive into that film and really try to help understand why it was made and its history. And I feel like we did that very well today. And next time I watch the film, I'll understand and appreciate it a little bit more because of our conversation today. And I hope that you do too. So on behalf of everyone here, thanks for being here, and we will see you soon.